Of course, today here in Salt Lake City, they're commemorating 100 years of Utah basketball. So many great names are here. This is the greatest name of them all because Utah has one national championship in its school history and an NIT championship when that was the most prestigious tournament in the country. And Arnie Farron was the star player on both of those teams. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's fun to be part of the 100-year history of Utah basketball. But Coach Broyland last night said, you don't know how much pressure you're putting on us to have the history of the school here to watch this game.
What a good-looking young dude you were back then. And you said several of your teammates who we're going to see Amoroso miss for San Diego State. And Arnie, several of your teammates. You still live here in Salt Lake City, right?
Yes.
So you follow the Utes carefully?
Very carefully.
And this first year as Borja hits a three with Lawrence Borja. Tell us what you see this year, the first year with Jim Boylan coaching.
The more you get to know him, the more impressed you are with him as a coach. Hard to follow somebody that's had a losing season and has been, well, the coaching changed. You don't really inherit a lot of talent or there wouldn't have been a change. Right. So I think he's doing it very well.
All right, I'm going to put some pressure on you, Arnie. You said now 5 other players are here from that 1944 championship team. Can you name your starting 5?
Yes, without any problem. But let me tell you about them. 5 of the players who played in the 1940 NCAA championship all played pro ball. Wow. They were all in the NBA, so they were really exceptional athletes.
Now I noticed also when they listed you at Utah Youth, the running part wasn't in there. Were y'all not a running team?
Well, there was no clock. So what you did is you played tough defense and you coasted a little bit on offense. So our score was in the 40s most of the games we played.
And then, of course, in 1947, you beat the great Kentucky team to win the NIT, which again, that was the championship that was so coveted.
And that was the best team in the nation, that Kentucky team. You know, 5 of them turned pro as a team, Indianapolis Olympia. And Ralph Baird probably was one of the great basketball players of all time. So that was our night. It wasn't theirs, but we were proud to be there.
What do you mean? What do you remember about that game? Do you remember Adolph Rupp at all?
He was a good friend, so I remember him very well. We played them in 1944 in the NIT.
Okay. Well, coming up at halftime, there'll be a tremendous ceremony here on the court in Salt Lake City, and we'll take a look back at the 1944 championship team here in Utah, captained by Arnie Farron. He was the freshman MVP of the Final Four. How about that? We'll do that at halftime. And Arnie, thank you very much for being with us and joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Tom. Enjoyed the second half.
Thank you. Arnie Farron, one of the great names in the history of Utah basketball.
Welcome into the studios of the Mountain. We are at the half of Utah and San Diego State, but let's talk Utes. Arnie Farron made the Utes All-Century team for, among other things, the leading role he played in the Utes' 1944 Cinderella story. That year, the country was at war, and the NCAA tournament was still relatively new. But the resolve of some Western boys from Salt Lake City to prove themselves would steal the show. Sammy Linebaugh takes us back and behind the scenes of one of college basketball's most unique seasons.
If a single road trip could set the course of a man's life.
There's a conglomeration of pictures over on the left that Pat put together of my career.
Arnie Farron says the journey he took in the spring of 1944 with this team was it.
In 1944, everybody that played on our team lived within 35 miles of the school, and there were no scholarships. We walked on and tried out to make the team.
World War II was raging then, and the NCAA tournament was in its infancy. The University of Utah that season went 18-3 under head coach Badel Peterson. The average age of his players, 18 and a half.
We had a bid to play in the NCAA tournament that was in Kansas City, and I don't believe there was a guarantee. They give you a percentage of what happened, or we could go to New York City and play in the NIT, and of course Madison Square Garden was the mecca of basketball, so it wasn't a hard choice for us. But as we talked about it, there are only 2 people, including the coaches, that had ever been to New York City.
And you know, we were the typical country people. You know, we'd go around straining our looking up at the tall buildings, you know, and taking in the whole thing.
Watt Misaka was also part of that 1944 team, a Japanese-American well aware anti-Japanese sentiment was at a fever pitch in parts of the country.
Friends of mine, when I went into the service, they were being drafted into the United States Army when their parents and their families were put in prison camps, you know, and so I just couldn't imagine what kind of turmoil that would cause.
Even in wartime, college basketball was big, and Watt Misaka and the Utes were headed east. Imagine the trip from Salt Lake to New York City, a 3-day train ride. In 1944, there were no commercial airplanes to take teams around. There wasn't any television, for that matter, to broadcast the games. But March Madness existed even then, as Utah, who had set out to compete in the NIT, found themselves competing in the NCAA brackets after all.
We got the phone call that Arkansas had been in this accident and couldn't go to Kansas City and play in the NCAA tournament.
Almost as fast as they'd arrived in New York, the Utes had lost in the first round of the NIT to Kentucky.
We played Kentucky, and that game, Vadel had never had a scouting report. So we got to New York City, and he bought one. I think he told us that he bought a scouting report for $25 that was going to help us. And he bought it off of somebody on the street. And the scouting report said that one of their guards didn't shoot. He was the high scorer against us.
As it turned out, there was no time for that. The Utes were invited to take Arkansas's place in the NCAA tournament in Kansas City if they could make the 2-day trip in time. And though it meant they would have to leave New York right away, it also offered a chance at redemption. The winner of the Kansas City bracket would play for the NCAA championship at Madison Square Garden.
We felt like we could turn it around and be back and show these guys.
Well, that's exactly what they did. Not only were they back in the big city, but this time the Utes were the welcome underdog.
We would have people cheer for us and yell at us even when we were walking on the streets in New York. And a bunch of scrawny kids from the mountains that, you know, wide-eyed, coming to the Big Apple for the first time for most of us. And I think they kind of took us under their wings, saying, hey, these guys are for real. And
what's more, number 17 had become the crowd favorite.
The people resoundingly applauded him and gave him credit for the effort that he had on the basketball floor.
It really made me proud that I was an American.
The night of the NCAA championship game, Utah versus Dartmouth, Madison Square Garden was packed to the rafters.
They allowed smoking in the garden. And everybody on the first few rows were smoking cigars. And you'd stand when they played the national anthem and look up at the ceiling. You couldn't see the flag for the cigar smoke. And that was really a new experience for us.
And that was the game that Arnie really broke out. And he had a feeling that game, I think, because he kept making the baskets, kept shooting, kept making the baskets, and like I said earlier, he scored 22 points, which is really significant because that's the number on his jersey.
We ended up beating Dartmouth. Then we ended up playing St. John's, who had won the NIT, which the tournament that we'd lost in, and we beat them. They called the team the Cinderella team because we had to have a glass slipper for all of those things to fall in place for us to come back and do that.
It wasn't until much later Barron and Misaka realized the impact of what they'd achieved, what it meant for a country at war to have heroes who could transcend the battle.
And since then, I've had numbers of people tell me where they were when that game was played and how they. Of course, there was no television, so everyone had to listen to it on the radio.
I've talked to people who were in the foxhole, saying I'm sitting in the foxhole during the war, and the only thing that I had to remind myself of what was at home was listening to that basketball game.
It was also several years before they asked themselves the question, whatever became of that Arkansas team who never made it to the tournament?
All of them had upsets in their lives. Some became alcoholics, and there were some suicides. We all have looked at ourselves and thought, isn't that too bad that we were unaware of what happened to them to our advantage.
Both Farron and Misaka went on to play professionally after helping lead the Utes to the NIT championship in 1947. Misaka was the first non-Caucasian drafted into the NBA, the same year Jackie Robinson broke into baseball.
And that's been kind of the highlight of my life. Even though it's over 50 years ago that's happened, it's really lucky, and I don't think that you'd ever find a stroke of luck like that anyplace.
The road trip of 1944, turns out, really never ended.
So in my life, it's opened so many doors for me that would not have been available, perhaps, if we hadn't had the occasions to compete in basketball at the level that we did.
Brings back the sweet memories of something that you can live by.
In Salt Lake City, Sammy Leinbach for the Mountain.
A total of 5 players from that 1944 team were drafted into the pros: Arnie Farron, Wat Misaka, Herb Wilkinson, Fred Sheffield, and Dick Smunin.
Halftime in Salt Lake City. Special day here at the University of Utah. Ceremony still going on, a little longer halftime because of it, to honor 100 years of Utah basketball, the all-century team. 100 players representing the best in Utah basketball, all here today, and the top 16 have been honored as part of the all-century team. Arnie Farron, who we heard from in the first half, he was the MVP of the 1944 Final Four as a freshman, and then in 1947 led Utah to an NIT title. Tom Chambers, what a great player he was. And doesn't seem right to see Chambers without brains right next to him. Tom Chambers still looking good. Mike Doliak, part of the Utah's team that turned things around here under Rick Majerus. Of course, Keith Van Horn, just being honored a moment ago. And there's the all-century team representing the best of 100 years of Utah basketball. Great name, Mike Newland, who was a fabulous shooting guard here. Billy McGill, in fact, Billy McGill played in the ABA in the old days. Yeah, we saw a little rolling hook from him. And all of them here, unfortunately, Andre Miller not able to be here, but even Andrew Bogut just being introduced now as the final member of the all-century team of Utah basketball. Just that list of names gives you an idea of how great the tradition is. And this city that has so many times hosted NCAA tournament basketball, these people love this game, and it's really personified in the great players you see, and these people have been standing for 15 minutes straight here at the Huntsman Center to applaud their efforts. Well, the present-day Utes have a 2-point lead at the half. We'll come back and recap it on Versus.